At precisely 8:30 p.m. on May 28, 1996, a chilling call came into the sheriff's office. The voice on the other end trembled as it reported a suspicious death at the county hospital. The dispatcher could only make out a few panicked words: man dead, gunshot wounds, face. The grim silence that followed was cut by the urgency of flashing sirens as officers raced to the scene. Joe, a 32-year-old mechanic, had been rushed to the hospital. His face and side bore the devastating marks of two precise gunshots. The doctors barely spoke. There was no need. Joe was dead on arrival. His wife, Sama, and her family hovered nearby, their faces drained of color, eyes wide with shock. Detectives began piecing together the story from fragmented accounts. Joe's brother-in-law, visibly shaken, recounted the moments before the tragedy. Sama was driving on the freeway when her car got a flat. She called Joe. He showed up maybe 20 minutes later. After fixing the tire, this guy came out of nowhere, wearing a motorcycle helmet. He shot Joe, point blank, then just walked away like it was nothing. Sama, standing a few feet away, was still clutching her purse as if it were the only thing tethering her to reality. When questioned, she confirmed her brother's story. The killer, she claimed, was a man in a motorcycle helmet. Her voice was soft, but her words came quickly, almost too perfectly, as though she had rehearsed every line in her head. Despite the clarity of the accounts, something didn't sit right with the detectives. The scene was too clean, too easy. Officers scoured the area where Joe had fallen, but found no evidence of a struggle, no shell casings, and most troublingly, no sign of a flat tire. They checked Sama's car thoroughly. Each tire was intact, showing no signs of recent damage. The detectives exchanged uneasy glances. The cracks in the story were beginning to show. The deeper they dug, the more inconsistencies surfaced. A witness who had been driving along the same stretch of highway mentioned seeing a man leaving the scene, but he wasn't wearing a helmet, and the timeline didn't add up. How could Joe have arrived just 20 minutes after being called and then met his death so quickly? Something was off, and it wasn't long before suspicion began to fall on Sama herself. The next day, Sama was brought in for further questioning. Under the harsh lights of the interrogation room, her calm facade started to waver. She fidgeted with her wedding ring, her eyes darting nervously as she repeated her story. But when faced with the fact that there had been no flat tire, her voice faltered. The detectives pressed harder, and it wasn't long before the mask fell completely. Tears welled up in her eyes, and her voice dropped to a whisper. "It was my ex-fiancé," she finally admitted. "He knew about Joe and me. He said if I didn't help him, he'd kill Joe himself." The confession that followed was chilling. Sama detailed a plan that had been brewing for weeks. She and her ex-fiancé had been in contact, reconnecting after years apart. He had learned about her failing marriage, how Joe had become distant, even violent at times. Sama had complained to him, seeking comfort, but what she got was something darker. Her ex-fiancé had offered a solution: murder. "I didn't want it," she claimed, her voice shaking, "but he told me he'd do it with or without me." On the night of the murder, Sama lured Joe to the freeway with a fabricated story about a flat tire. "He told me to stay in the car and lock the doors," she said, staring blankly at the table in front of her. "I watched from the window as he bent down to check the tire. That's when my ex-fiancé appeared. He came from behind a dirt hill, and before Joe could react, he fired. It all happened so fast." Detectives, following this new lead, quickly uncovered the murder weapon, a hunting rifle stashed away in the home of a woman connected to Sama's ex. The weapon was a perfect match for the one used in Joe's killing. Within days, Sama's ex-fiancé was arrested and brought in for questioning. Faced with the evidence, he confessed. He admitted to planning Joe's murder and carrying it out with cold, calculated precision. But the case, while seemingly solved, refused to rest. Months later, Sama's ex-fiancé requested another interrogation. He looked gaunt, his once defiant gaze now clouded with uncertainty. "I lied," he said, his voice breaking. "I didn't plan on killing Joe." He went on to describe how he and Sama had reconnected through Instagram. Their old friendship had rekindled in the darkest way possible. Sama had told him about the abuse she claimed to suffer at Joe's hands, how he was addicted to drugs, how he would lash out in fits of rage. She begged her ex-fiancé for help, and in a moment of weakness, he agreed to meet her in person. "She wanted him dead," he said, his hands trembling slightly. "But I didn't want that. I thought maybe I could just scare him, plant a gun in his car, make him look guilty of something. But things got out of control." On the night of the murder, he claimed, he arrived on the scene only to find Joe waiting for him. A fight broke out, and during the struggle, the gun discharged accidentally. "I didn't mean to shoot him," he insisted. "But as I ran, I saw something, someone else. There was a man in a helmet. I swear it wasn't me who killed Joe. I only fired once, but someone else was there." His words sent a ripple of unease through the detectives. A man in a helmet. This detail had been in Sama's original story, but it had been dismissed as a fabrication. Now, hearing it again from a second source, doubt began to seep back in. Could there have been another player in this twisted game of lies and betrayal? The detectives revisited the crime scene, scouring every inch for clues they might have missed. It was there, hidden beneath layers of dust and time, that they found a faint, almost invisible set of footprints leading away from the dirt hill, footprints that hadn't been there before. And then there were the tire tracks. At first glance, they seemed ordinary, belonging to Joe's car. But upon closer inspection, there was another set, nearly identical, but slightly offset, as if someone else had been parked there too. Someone who had left before the authorities arrived. The investigation reopened, but it yielded more questions than answers. Who was the man in the helmet? Why did Sama's ex-fiancé suddenly change his story? And what was the real motive behind Joe's death? The truth, it seemed, was buried beneath layers of deception, waiting for the right moment to surface. As the months turned into years, the case became an unsolved enigma, a ghost story whispered among the officers who had worked on it. Somewhere, someone knew what really happened that night. And somewhere the man in the helmet was still out there, lurking in the shadows of a mystery that might never be fully uncovered.